Hello everyone, welcome to my video on Dragon's Tiger 1 late with moulded on zimmerit. I built it just adding a few little things. Here along the side there was a little gap with the side fenders or mudguards, filled those with some putty. The MG mount, the machine gun was pushed back a bit as it sticks out a little bit too far. On the front I redid some of the zimmerit with a trumpeter zimmerit tool using some Magisculpt putty, and also added some of the clasps that are meant to hold the front mudguards down out of plastic card. On the top I added a couple of tool clamps just to leave them empty as a point of interest. The bracket that goes along the top of the mantlet should have a gap either side, so I used a scalpel to carve this out. An aftermarket tow rope was added as the one in the kit was a bit too springy. I left the kit's track cable on the side of the vehicle just to show you how I'm going to paint it. And as I said, I filled the gap along the mud guards with some plastic putty. On the back here I added a couple of wing nuts out of the spares box to the rear mud guards and to the front as well. Made sure that the rear bolt on the top of the exhaust is facing towards the rear. In the kit they're slightly different, but the bolt has to face towards the rear. So you have to remove the pins that hold it up, fill the holes and then just turn it round. It's not a hard job. I removed the seam in the exhaust shroud with a scalpel. I just thinned it out for a bit more scale thickness. The screens are from the kit and they're nicely done. I added a couple of thin pieces of plastic card to the fire extinguisher bracket as the one in the kit was a little bit overscale. On the engine retaining clamps you need to add a little cutaway. I've done that with a scalpel. More wing nuts were added to the top of the barrel cleaning rod holders, and I added a couple more clamps to the bottom of the tools there. I replaced the moulded on handles on the jack with some made from copper wire. I had to add some putty around the join for the turret, and I also accentuated the weld seams. I re-drilled the holes around the armoured guard under the turret as they're in the wrong place. So I've just redone those after looking at some references and added some spare track holders to the front, as I was basing this vehicle on one of the ones that actually made it out of Normandy. A little bit more of the zimmerit added underneath for the Magisculpt, and a trumpeter zimmerit tool, and that was ready to be painted. After I'd given the model a wash in some washing up detergent, I then used a car primer just to prime it. Once the primer is dried, which helps show up any flaws that might need any attention, I then used some Vallejo Model Air German camouflage black brown in my airbrush, which didn't need to be thinned. And I added this all around the weld seams, into recesses, and also on the tracks. I now used AK Real Colours Dunkel Gelb as well as their own thinner. Added thinner to the airbrush first, then apply the colour because it helps thin it a little. And then applied it in a misting and clouding motion all over the vehicle to give it its base colour. Once the hull was done, I then applied the colour to the turret. Make sure the pre-shade shows through a little bit. You don't want to ruin all the previous work. I now use some AK Real Colours Flat White. Added this to the base Dunkel Gelb just to show highlights. Here I am using a piece of card on the turret to show how you can stage the tone of the colour and then blend it in afterwards. Now that all the highlighting had been done, it was now time to move on, but you can still see the pre-shade showing through. Now it's time to add the first camouflage colour. For this I use AK Real Colours Rot Brown, or Red Brown in English I think it is, and applied this. It was a little bit too bright, so I then added Tamier Red Brown to the mix, just to darken the colour slightly, and carried on with the camouflage pattern. Now, working from my references, I just carried on the colour onto the turret. To add a faded look to the brown colour, I added the Dunkelgelb to the mix and just faded it on in a cloudy pattern. The next camouflage colour I used was AK Real Colours Olive Green, and working from the references again, I applied this after cleaning the airbrush, thinned it with some of their own thinner and sprayed it on. Once the hull was done, I then carried on onto the turret and the gun. Now that the base camouflage colours were applied, I then used some Tamiya 88, misted this over just to tone the colours down a little. Also added some Tamiya XF2 flat white just to tone them down even more and add a dusty appearance to the model. To pick out some of the equipment on the model, I now use Vallejo's World War II beige along with some of their buff. Mix these together and picked out the jack, the C-hooks, fire extinguisher, around the edges of the hatches, the commander's machine gun mount, and the towing eyes. Now it's time to paint the spare tracks and the exhaust. The colours I used for this was Vallejo's London Grey and their white. Mixing the colours onto the tape, painting the tracks and highlighting with a little white here and there just to vary the tone on the tracks. And also on the exhaust. Once the greys were added to the exhaust, keeping it light towards the top, I then added the colours from earlier where I used the buff and the German World War II beige, just to add a bit more colour to the top around the bolts. And on the metal pins that hold it in place. Now happy with that, it was time to paint the periscopes using Vallejo's German camouflage black brown. The periscopes were mainly made out of Bakelite, which came in black or brown as far as I understand. Using a finely pointed brush, I picked out all the periscopes on the vehicle, and here I am pointing them out on the turret. I now use Vallejo's Panzer Races dark rubber to paint the rubber that was attached to the driver and co-driver's periscopes. Now to add a filter to the model, I use some enamel thinners, yellow ochre, buff, white and Naples yellow oil paint, along with a small amount of sap green. I then dotted these all over the model and blended these with a soft brush, dampened with the thinner. Adding a filter adds a variation in tone to the model. Now taking some burnt sienna and Van Dyke brown oil paint, I mix these with some clean thinner, made another filter and added this to the brown colour on the model just to enrich it a little more. Here you can see the difference between the tone on the hull and the tone on the turret. I now took some Tamiya XF57 buff and some Tamiya white, thinned it with some of their own thinner, and now added a dust shade over the base colours that had been filtered. I now used a Humbrol acrylic clear and sprayed this on in several thin coats. This helps seal the paint that's underneath. The Humbrol clear now needs 24 hours to dry before the next stages. Thanks for watching the video. In the next one I'll be showing you how I weathered the model. See you next time.